Section 44 of the World's Best Orations, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Beeswax Candle. The World's Best Orations, from the Earliest Period to the Present Time, Volume 1, by David J. Brewer and Edward A. Allen. The Meaning of Conservatism, Part 2, Lord Beaconsfield. Gentlemen, you will perhaps not be surprised that, having made some remarks upon the monarchy and the House of Lords, I should say something respecting that house in which I have literally passed the greater part of my life, and to which I am devotedly attached. It is not likely, therefore, that I should say anything to depreciate the legitimate position and influence of the House of Commons. Gentlemen, it is said that the diminished power of the throne and the assailed authority of the House of Lords are owing to the increased power of the House of Commons, and the new position, which of late years, and especially during the last 40 years, it has assumed in the English Constitution. Gentlemen, the great power of the House of Commons depends upon its command over the public purse, and its control of the public expenditure, and if that power is possessed by a party which has a large majority in the House of Commons, the influence of the House of Commons is proportionately increased, and under some circumstances becomes more predominant. But, gentlemen, this power of the House of Commons is not a power that has been created by any Reform Act, from the days of Lord Grey in 1832 to 1867. It is the power which the House of Commons has enjoyed for centuries, which it has frequently asserted, and sometimes even tyrannically exercised. Gentlemen, the House of Commons represents the constituencies of England, and I am here to show that no addition to the elements of that constituency has placed the House of Commons in a different position with regard to the throne and the House of Lords from that it has always constitutionally occupied. Gentlemen, we speak now on this subject with great advantage. We recently have had published authentic documents upon this matter which are highly instructive. We have, for example, just published the census of Great Britain, and we are now in possession of the last registration of voters for the United Kingdom. Gentlemen, it appears that by the census the population at this time is about 32 million. It is shown by the last registration that after making the usual deductions for deaths, removals, double entries, and so on, the constituency of the United Kingdom may be placed at 2,200,000. So, gentlemen, it at once appears that there are 30 million people in this country who are as much represented by the House of Lords as by the House of Commons, and who, for the protection of their rights, must depend upon them in the majesty of the throne. And now, gentlemen, I will tell you what was done by the last Reform Act. Lord Grey, in his measure of 1832, which was no doubt a statesmanlike measure, committed a great, and for a time it appeared, an irretrievable error. By that measure he fortified the legitimate influence of the aristocracy, and accorded to the middle classes great and salutary franchises. But he not only made no provision for the representation of the working classes in the Constitution, but he absolutely abolished those ancient franchises which the working classes had peculiarly enjoyed and exercised from time immemorial. Gentlemen, that was the origin of Chartism, and of that electoral uneasiness which existed in this country more or less for 30 years. The Liberal party, I feel it my duty to say, had not acted fairly by this question. In their adversity, they held out hopes to the working classes, but when they had a strong government, they laughed their vows to scorn. In 1848, there was a French Revolution, and a republic was established. No one can have forgotten what the effect was in this country. I remember the day when not a woman could leave her house in London, and when cannon were planted on Westminster Bridge. When Lord Derby became Prime Minister, affairs had arrived at such a point that it was of the first moment that the question should be sincerely dealt with. He had to encounter great difficulties, but he accomplished his purpose with the support of a united party. And, gentlemen, what has been the result? A year ago there was another revolution in France, and a republic was again established of the most menacing character. What happened in this country? You could not get half a dozen men to assemble in the street and grumble. Why? Because the people had got what they wanted. They were content, and they were grateful. But, gentlemen, the Constitution of England is not merely a constitution in state. It is a constitution in church and state. The wisest sovereigns and statesmen have ever been anxious to connect authority with religion, some to increase their power, some perhaps to mitigate its exercise. But the same difficulty has been experienced in effecting this union which has been experienced in forming a second chamber. Either the spiritual power has usurped upon the civil and established a sacerdotal society, or the civil power has invaded successfully the rights of the spiritual, and the ministers of religion have been degraded into stipendiaries of the state and instruments of the government. In England, we accomplished this great result by an alliance between church and state, between two originally independent powers. I will not go into the history of that alliance, which is rather a question for those archaeological societies which occasionally amuse and instruct the people of this city. Enough for me that this union was made and has contributed for centuries to the civilization of this country. Gentlemen, there is the same assault against the Church of England and the union between the state and the church as there is against the monarchy and against the House of Lords. It is said that the existence of nonconformity proves that the church is a failure. I draw from these premises an exactly contrary conclusion, and I maintain that to have secured a national profession of faith with the unlimited enjoyment of private judgment in matters spiritual is the solution of the most difficult problem, and one of the triumphs in civilization. It is said that the existence of parties in the church also proves its incompetence. On that matter, too, I entertain a contrary opinion. Parties have always existed in the church, and some have appealed to them as arguments in favour of its divine institution, because in the services and doctrines of the church have been found representatives of every mood in the human mind. Those who are influenced by ceremonies find consolation in forms which secure to them the beauty of holiness. Those who are not satisfied except with enthusiasm find in its ministrations the exaltation they require, while others who believe that the anchor of faith can never be safely moored except in the dry sands of reason find a religion within the pale of the church which can boast of its irrefragable logic and its irresistible evidence. Gentlemen, I am inclined sometimes to believe that those who advocate the abolition of the union between church and state have not carefully considered the consequences of such a course. The church is a powerful corporation of many millions of Her Majesty's subjects, with a consummate organization and wealth, which in its aggregate is vast. Restricted and controlled by the state, so powerful a corporation may be only fruitful of public advantage. But it becomes a great question what might be the consequences of the severance of the controlling tie between these two bodies. The state would be enfeebled, but the church would probably be strengthened. Whether that is a result to be desired is a grave question for all men. For my own part, I am bound to say that I doubt whether it would be favourable to the cause of civil and religious liberty. I know that there is a common idea that if the union between church and state was severed, the wealth of the church would revert to the state. But it would be well to remember that the great proportion of ecclesiastical property is the property of individuals. Take, for example, the fact that the great mass of church patronage is patronage in the hands of private persons. That you could not touch without compensation to the patrons. You have established that principle in your late Irish Bill, where there was very little patronage. And in the present state of the public mind on the subject, there is very little doubt that there would be scarcely a patron in England, irrespective of other aid the church would receive, who would not dedicate his compensation to the spiritual wants of his neighbours. It was computed some years ago that the property of the church in this manner, if the union was terminated, would not be less than between 80 million and 90 million pounds. And since that period, the amount of private property dedicated to the purposes of the Church has very largely increased. I therefore trust that when the occasion offers for the country to speak out, it will speak out in an unmistakable manner on this subject, and recognizing the inestimable services of the Church, that it will call upon the government to maintain its union with the state. Upon this subject there is one remark I would make. Nothing is more surprising to me than the plea on which the present outcry is made against the Church of England. I could not believe that in the 19th century the charge against the Church of England should be that churchmen, and especially the clergy, had educated the people. If I were to fix upon one circumstance more than another which redounded to the honour of churchmen, it is that they should fulfil this noble office. And next to being the stewards of divine mysteries, I think the greatest distinction of the clergy is the admirable manner in which they have devoted their lives and their fortunes to this greatest of national objects. Gentlemen, you are well acquainted in this city with this controversy. It was in this city, I don't know whether it was not in this hall, that the remarkable meeting was held of the nonconformists to effect important alterations in the Education Act, and you are acquainted with the discussion in Parliament which arose in consequence of that meeting. Gentlemen, I have due and great respect for the nonconformist body. I acknowledge their services to their country, and though I believe that the political reasons which mainly called them into existence have entirely ceased, it is impossible not to treat with consideration a body which has been eminent for its conscience, its learning, and its patriotism. But I must express my mortification that, from a feeling of envy or of pique, the nonconformist body, rather than assist the Church in its great enterprise, should absolutely have become the partisans of a merely secular education. I believe myself, gentlemen, that without the recognition of a superintending providence in the affairs of this world, all national education will be disastrous, and I feel confident that it is impossible to stop at that mere recognition. Religious education is demanded by the nation generally, and by the instincts of human nature. I should like to see the Church and the nonconformists work together, but I trust, whatever may be the result, the country will stand by the Church in its efforts to maintain the religious education of the people. Gentlemen, I foresee yet trials for the Church of England, but I am confident in its future. I am confident in its future because I believe there is now a very general feeling that to be national it must be comprehensive. I will not use the word broad, because it is an epithet applied to a system with which I have no sympathy. But I would wish churchmen, and especially the clergy, always to remember that in our Father's house there are many mansions. And I believe that comprehensive spirit is perfectly consistent with the maintenance of formularies and the belief in dogmas without which I hold no practical religion can exist. Gentlemen, I have now endeavoured to express to you my general views upon the most important subjects that can interest Englishmen. They are subjects upon which, in my mind, a man should speak with frankness and clearness to his countrymen, and although I do not come down here to make a party speech, I am bound to say that the manner in which those subjects are treated by the leading subject of this realm is to me most unsatisfactory. Although the Prime Minister of England is always writing letters and making speeches, and particularly on these topics, he seems to me ever to send forth an uncertain sound. If a member of Parliament announces himself a Republican, Mr. Gladstone takes the earliest opportunity of describing him as a fellow worker in public life. If an inconsiderate multitude calls for the abolition or reform of the House of Lords, Mr. Gladstone says that it is no easy task, and he must think once or twice, or perhaps even thrice, before he can undertake it. If your neighbour, the member for Bradford, Mr. Meal, brings forward a motion in the House of Commons for the severance of Church and State, Mr. Gladstone assures Mr. Meal, with the utmost courtesy, that he believes the opinion of the House of Commons is against him, but that if Mr. Meal wishes to influence the House of Commons, he must address the people out of doors. Whereupon Mr. Meal immediately calls a public meeting, and alleges as its cause the advice he has just received from the Prime Minister. But, gentlemen, after all, The test of political institutions is the condition of the country whose fortunes they regulate, and I do not mean to evade that test. You are the inhabitants of an island of no colossal size, which, geographically speaking, was intended by nature as the appendage of some continental empire, either of Gauls and Franks on the other side of the Channel, or of Teutons and Scandinavians beyond the German Sea. In such, indeed, and for a long period, was your early history. You were invaded, you were pillaged, and you were conquered. Yet amid all these disgraces and vicissitudes, there was gradually formed that English race, which has brought about a very different state of affairs. Instead of being invaded, your land is proverbially the only inviolate land, the inviolate land of the sage and free. Instead of being plundered, you have attracted to your shores all the capital of the world. Instead of being conquered, your flag floats on many waters, and your standard waves in either zone. It may be said that these achievements are due to the race that inhabited the land, and not to its institutions. Gentlemen, in political institutions are the embodied experiences of a race. You have established a society of classes which give vigour and variety to life. But no class possesses a single exclusive privilege, and all are equal before the law. You possess a real aristocracy, open to all who desire to enter it. You have not merely a middle class, but a hierarchy of middle classes, in which every degree of wealth, refinement, industry, energy, and enterprise is duly represented. And now, gentlemen, what is the condition of the great body of the people? In the first place, gentlemen, they have for centuries been in the full enjoyment of that which no other country in Europe has ever completely attained, complete rights of personal freedom. In the second place, there has been a gradual and therefore a wise distribution on a large scale of political rights. Speaking with reference to the industries of this great part of the country, I can personally contrast it with the conditions of the working classes 40 years ago. In that period, they have attained two results: the raising of their wages and the diminution of their toil. Increased means and increased leisure are the two civilizers of man. But the working classes of Lancashire and Yorkshire have proved not unworthy of these boons, may be easily maintained. But their progress and elevation have been during this interval wonderfully aided and assisted by three causes, which are not so distinctively attributable to their own energies. The first is the revolution in locomotion, which has opened the world to the working man, which has enlarged the horizon of his experience, increased his knowledge of nature and of art, and added immensely to the salutary recreation, amusement, and pleasure of his existence. The second cause is the cheap postage, the moral benefits of which cannot be exaggerated. And the third is that unshackled press which has furnished him with endless sources of instruction, information, and amusement. Gentlemen, if you would permit me, I would now make an observation upon another class of the labouring population. This is not a civic assembly, although we meet in a city. That was for convenience, but the invitation which I received was to meet the county and all the boroughs of Lancashire, and I wish to make a few observations upon the condition of the agricultural labourer. That is a subject which now greatly attracts public attention, and in the first place, to prevent any misconception, I beg to express my opinion that an agricultural labourer has as much right to combine for the bettering of his condition as a manufacturing labourer or a worker in metals. If the causes of his combination are natural, that is to say, if they arise from his own feelings and from the necessities of his own condition, the combination will end in results mutually beneficial to employers and employed. If, on the other hand, it is factitious, and he is acted upon by extraneous influences and extraneous ideas, the combination will produce, I fear, much loss and misery both to employers and employed, and after a time he will find himself in a similar, or in a worse, position. Gentlemen, in my opinion, the farmers of England cannot, as a body, afford to pay higher wages than they do. And those who will answer me by saying that they must find their ability by the reduction of rents, are, I think, involving themselves with economic laws which may prove too difficult for them to cope with. The profits of a farmer are very moderate. The interest upon capital invested in land is the smallest that any property furnishes. The farmer will have his profits, and the investor in land will have his interest, even though they may be obtained at the cost of changing the mode of the cultivation of the country. Gentlemen, I should deeply regret to see the tillage of this country reduced, and a recurrence to pasture take place. I should regret it principally on account of the agricultural labourers themselves. Their new friends call them Hodge, and describe them as a stolid race. I must say that from my experience of them, they are sufficiently shrewd and open to reason. I would say to them with confidence, as the great Athenian said to the Spartan who rudely assailed him, "Strike, but hear me." First, a change in the cultivation of the soil of this country would be very injurious to the labouring class. And second, I am of the opinion that that class, instead of being stationary, has made, if not as much progress as the manufacturing class, very considerable progress during the last 40 years. Many persons write and speak about the agricultural labourer with not so perfect a knowledge of his condition as is desirable. They treat him always as a human being who in every part of the country finds himself in an identical condition. Now, on the contrary, there is no class of labourers in which there is a greater variety of condition than that of the agricultural labourers. It changes from north to south, from east to west, and from county to county. It changes even in the same county, where there is an alteration of soil and of configuration. The hind in Northumberland is in a very different condition from the famous Dorsetshire labourer. The tiller of the soil in Lincolnshire is different from his fellow agriculturalist in Sussex. What the effects of manufactures is upon the agricultural districts in their neighbourhood it would be presumption in me to dwell upon. Your own experience must tell you whether the agricultural labourer in North Lancashire, for example, has had no rise in wages and no diminution in toil. Take the case of the Dorsetshire labourer. The whole of the agricultural labourers in the south-western coast of England for a very long period worked only half the time of the labourers in other parts of England, and received only half the wages. In the experience of many, I dare say, who were here present, even 30 years ago, the Dorsetshire labourer never worked after 3 o'clock in the day. And why? Because the whole of that part of England was demoralised by smuggling. No one worked after 3 o'clock in the day for a very good reason. Because he had to work at night. No farmer allowed his team to be employed after 3 o'clock, because he reserved his horses to take his illicit cargo at night and carry it rapidly into the interior. Therefore, as the men were employed and remunerated otherwise, they got into a habit of half work and half pay, so far as the land was concerned, and when smuggling was abolished, and it has only been abolished for 30 years, these imperfect habits of labour continued, and do even now continue to a great extent. That is the origin of the condition of the agricultural labourer in the southwestern part of England. But now, gentlemen, I want to test the condition of the agricultural labourer generally, and I will take a part of England with which I am familiar and can speak as to the accuracy of the facts. I mean the group described as the South Midland counties. The conditions of labour there are the same, or pretty nearly the same, throughout. The group may be described as a strictly agricultural community, and they embrace a population of probably 1.5 million. Now, I have no hesitation in saying that the improvement in their lot during the last 40 years has been progressive and is remarkable. I attribute it to 3 causes. In the first place, the rise in their money wages is no less than 15%. The second great cause of their improvement is the almost total disappearance of excessive and exhausting toil from the general introduction of machinery. I don't know whether I could get a couple of men who could, or if they could, would thresh a load of wheat in my neighbourhood. The third great cause which has improved their condition is the very general, not to say universal, institution of allotment grounds. Now, gentlemen, When I find that this has been the course of affairs in our very considerable and strictly agricultural portion of the country, where there have been no exceptional circumstances, like smuggling, to degrade and demoralize the race, I cannot resist the conviction that the condition of the agricultural labourers, instead of being stationary, as we are constantly told by those not acquainted with them, has been one of progressive improvement, and that in those counties, and they are many, where the stimulating influence of a manufacturing neighbourhood acts upon the land, the general conclusion at which I arrive is that the agricultural labourer has had his share in the advance of national prosperity. Gentlemen, I am not here to maintain that there is nothing to be done to increase the well-being of the working classes of this country, generally speaking. There is not a single class in the country which is not susceptible of improvement, and that makes the life and animation of our society. But in all we do, we must remember, as my noble friend told them at Liverpool, that much depends upon the working classes themselves, and what I know of the working classes in Lancashire makes me sure that they will respond to this appeal. Much also may be expected from that sympathy between classes which is a distinctive feature of the present day. And in the last place, no inconsiderable results may be obtained by judicious and prudent legislation. The gentlemen, in attempting to legislate upon social matters, the great object is to be practical, to have before us some distinct aims and some distinct means by which they can be accomplished. Gentlemen, I think public attention as regards these matters ought to be concentrated upon sanitary legislation. That is a wide subject, and if properly treated, comprises almost every consideration which has a just claim upon legislative interference. Pure air, pure water, the inspection of unhealthy habitations, the adulteration of food, these and many kindred matters may be legitimately dealt with by the legislature, and I am bound to say the legislature is not idle upon them, for we have at this time two important measures before Parliament on the subject. One, by a late colleague of mine, Sir Charles Adderley, is a large and comprehensive measure, founded upon a sure basis, for it consolidates all existing public acts and improves them. A prejudice has been raised against that proposal by stating that it interferes with the private acts of the great towns. I take this opportunity of contradicting that. The bill of Sir Charles Adderley does not touch the acts of the great towns. It only allows them, if they think fit, to avail themselves of its new provisions. The other measure by the government is of a partial character. What it comprises is good, so far as it goes, but it shrinks from that bold consolidation of existing acts which I think one of the great merits of Sir Charles Adderley's bill, which permits us to become acquainted with how much may be done in favour of sanitary improvement by existing provisions. Gentlemen, I cannot impress upon you too strongly my conviction of the importance of the legislature and society uniting together in favour of these important results. A great scholar and a great wit, 300 years ago, said that in his opinion there was a great mistake in the Vulgate, which, as you all know, is the Latin translation of the Holy Scriptures, and then instead of saying vanity of vanities all is vanity, vanitas vanitatum omnia vanitas, the wise and witty king really said, sanitas sanitatum omnia sanitas. Gentlemen, it is impossible to overrate the importance of the subject. After all, the first consideration of a minister should be the health of the people. A land may be covered with historic trophies, with museums of science and galleries of art, with universities and with libraries. The people may be civilized and ingenious. The country may be even famous in the annals and action of the world. But, gentlemen, if the population every 10 years decreases, and the stature of the race every 10 years diminishes, the history of that country will soon be the history of the past. Gentlemen, I said I had not come here to make a party speech. I have addressed you upon subjects of grave, and I will venture to believe of general interest. But to be here and altogether silent upon the present state of public affairs would not be respectful to you, and perhaps on the whole would be thought incongruous. Gentlemen, I cannot pretend that our position either at home or abroad is in my opinion satisfactory. At home, at a period of immense prosperity, with the people contented and naturally loyal, we find to our surprise the most extravagant doctrines professed, and the fundamental principles of our most valuable institutions impugned, and that too by persons of some authority. Gentlemen, this startling inconsistency is accounted for, in my mind, by the circumstances under which the present administration was formed. It is the first instance in my knowledge of a British administration being avowedly formed on a principle of violence. It is unnecessary for me to remind you of the circumstances which preceded the formation of that government. You were the principal scene and theatre of the development of statesmanship that then occurred. You witnessed the incubation of the portentous birth. You remember when you were informed that the policy to secure the prosperity of England and the content of Irishmen was a policy of sacrilege and confiscation. Gentlemen, when Ireland was placed under the wise and able administration of Lord Abercorn, Ireland was prosperous, and I may say content. But there happened at that time a very peculiar conjuncture in politics. The Civil War in America had just ceased, and a band of military adventurers, Poles, Italians, and many Irishmen, concocted in New York a conspiracy to invade Ireland, with the belief that the whole country would rise to welcome them. How that conspiracy was baffled, how those plots were confounded, I need not now remind you. For that we were mainly indebted to the eminent qualities of a great man who has just left us. You remember how the constituencies were appealed to vote against the government which had made so unfit an appointment as that of Lord Mayo to the Viceroyalty of India. It was by his great qualities when Secretary of Ireland, by his vigilance, his courage, his patience, and his perseverance, that this conspiracy was defeated. Never was a minister better informed. He knew what was going on at New York just as well as what was going on in the city of Dublin. When the Fenian conspiracy had been entirely put down, it became necessary to consider the policy which it was expedient to pursue in Ireland. And it seemed to us at that time that what Ireland required after all the excitement which it had experienced was a policy which should largely develop its material resources. There were one or two subjects of a different character, which for the advantage of the state it would have been desirable to have settled, if that could have been effected with the general concurrence of both the great parties in that country. Had we remained in office, that would have been done. But we were destined to quit it, and we quitted it without a murmur. The policy of our successors was different. Their specific was to despoil churches and plunder landlords. And what has been the result? Sedition rampant, treason thinly veiled, and whenever a vacancy occurs in the representation, a candidate is returned pledged to the disruption of the realm. Her Majesty's new ministers proceeded in their career like a body of men under the influence of some delirious drug. Not satiated with the spoliation and anarchy of Ireland, they began to attack every institution and every interest, every class and calling in the country. It is curious to observe their course. They took into hand the army. What have they done? I will not comment on what they have done. I will historically state it, and leave you to draw the inference. So long as constitutional England has existed, there has been a jealousy among all classes against the existence of a standing army. As our empire expanded, and the existence of a large body of disciplined troops became a necessity, every precaution was taken to prevent the danger to our liberties which a standing army involved. It was a first principle not to concentrate in the island any overwhelming number of troops, and a considerable portion was distributed in the colonies. Care was taken that the troops generally should be officered by a class of men deeply interested in the property and the liberties of England. So extreme was the jealousy that the relations between that once constitutional force, the militia, and the sovereign were rigidly guarded, and it was carefully placed under local influences. All this has changed. We have a standing army of large amount, quartered and brigaded and encamped permanently in England, and fed by a considerable and constantly increasing reserve. In due time it will be officered by a class of men eminently scientific, but with no relations necessarily with society, while the militia is withdrawn from all local influences and placed under the immediate command of the Secretary of War. Thus, in the 19th century, we have a large standing army established in England, contrary to all the traditions of the land, and that by a liberal government, and with the warm acclamations of the Liberal party. End of section 44.